Welcome to you all. This is the second Europe and the World Forum that we organized this year, and we are most delighted to welcome Professor Richard Evans. I will also remind you that he will give a second talk tomorrow in the Debating Europe Forum tomorrow morning, and you're cordially invited to attend to that too. But let's go directly into Professor Evans' lecture, which will be introduced by my colleague Schifanoia. Please.
Yeah. Hi. Well, it's a huge pleasure to introduce Richard Evans to you. In part, it's also a personal pleasure because we were colleagues for how long? 8 years, something like that, in the 1990s. So it's a very personal pleasure for me. Richard was educated at Oxford and has spent his academic career in the UK, although he's held many visiting positions all over the world, actually from USA and Australia, and also in Germany, among other places, and has also taught at a number of very different institutions. I'll mention two of them because I think they are relevant to his academic career and his production. The first place is Birkbeck, where I was a colleague of his, where he was professor of history and also vice master and briefly master. And I think that's relevant because it's a very particular kind of institution which teaches predominantly adult or mature students in the evening. So there's a huge variety of people from a great variety of different backgrounds, and actually a great variety of skills and preparation. And he moved from there, this very much kind of radical institution, to a completely different institution, about as far away from Birkbeck as you can possibly get, which is the University of Cambridge, where he's now Regius Professor of History, previously Professor of Modern History. I saw from your website, I like this little detail, that he's the first Regius Professor of History in Cambridge, rather than the Regius Professor of Modern History at Cambridge. He dropped the modern, he says, since journalists found it incomprehensible that the modern period started with the fall of the Roman Empire. And he's also president of Wolfson College, Cambridge, and visiting professor at Gresham College in London. In 2012, finally, he was appointed Knight Bachelor in the Queen's Birthday Honours List for services to scholarship. And I remember you saying to me at the time that this was very important, that you were knighted for services to scholarship. You're the only history professor to have been knighted for services to scholarship, I think. So that's quite, you said to me that you thought it was a particular honour, yeah. He's also the recipient of many other awards and prizes for his books. His books themselves are far too many to mention. They range from an early book on the feminist movement in 19th and early 20th century Germany, to Death, a prize-winning book. It won the Wilson Prize for History, Death in Hamburg, which is a path-breaking study of cholera from 1830 to 1910, and a major work on capital punishment in Germany called Rituals of Retribution, which ranged from the 17th century to the late 20th century to the 1980s. More recently, he's the author of a trilogy of books on Nazi Germany, published by Penguin between 2003 and 2011. He's also the author of several other books particularly on historiography and historical controversies. There are a number of these, but again, I'll mention just two. In Defense of History, which was exactly what it said, a defense of historical method, first published in 1997, but has also come out in several other editions. And Lying About Hitler, published in 2001, which is about Holocaust denial, and in particular was about Richard's role as an expert witness in the David Irving libel trial. All of these books, I should mention, has also been published translated and published in several languages. I think probably the only other thing I really want to mention before introducing his lecture is how that I think one of the things that should inspire all of us and is notable about Richard's work is in fact the sheer breadth of it. That's clear already from the titles that I've given you. The chronological range is, I think, these days quite surprising. You really are unusual in the extent to which you're happy in both the 19th and the 20th century. That's something that is increasingly rare these days. And indeed, his work on capital punishment looked also at the early modern period. But actually, just as impressive, or in some respects even more impressive, are the variety of his interests and fields that he's worked on. These range from the history of gender to legal history, and in Death in Hamburg, his area of research encompassed environmental history, medical history, social history, and political history. All of this, I should say, and again, this is something that I'd like to emphasize, is written in a very kind of readable narrative style. I think another thing that marks Richard's work out is the ability and skill to communicate. And to communicate the kind of sophisticated historical concepts and detailed archival work to a broad audience. I emphasize this also because Richard is known in Britain and more widely for his public role and his public interventions. I already mentioned his role as an expert witness in the David Irving trial. He's also, for example, and these are just a couple of examples, a member of the Spoliation Advisory Panel established in 2000 to advise on claims for the restitution of and compensation for artworks that are currently in government-funded museums and galleries that are alleged to have been stolen from their owners by the Nazis. And he's also, and I think this is particularly important for current debates, actively involved in a national debate on the teaching of history in UK schools. Anyone who knows anything about the UK will know this is a serious and important political issue right now. And he's done this both through journalistic articles in publications like the London Review of Books and the New Statesman, but also with discussions with members of the government, the UK government, notably with Michael Gove and David Willits, who are respectively Secretary of State for Education and Minister of State for Higher Education in the UK government. But this is not the reason why he's here this evening. The reason why he's here this evening is to talk about his book that he's currently writing, which is a book about 19th century Europe. So this is both a return to the 19th century from the Nazis, and also a broadening out beyond Germany to encompass the whole of Europe. The title of the book is The Pursuit of Power, Europe 1815 to 1914, and it's a volume in the Penguin History of Europe. But I'll now hand over to you, Richard.
Gosh, thank you very much. Yes, it is true that I probably will be the only person ever to have held the position of Regents Professor of Modern History and of History. We did drop the word modern, but in order to do that, we had to get the permission not just of the university, but of the Cabinet Office, the Prime Minister, the Privy Council, and the Queen, and it took over a year because it's, technically speaking, it's a royal appointment. It's very nice to be back here. It's by far from being the first time that I've actually been here, and nice to be amongst old colleagues and these two former students. So it's a great pleasure to be here. I did spend much of my career working on the 19th century. Before about 15 years ago, I moved into the 20th century. But even before I did that, I'd signed a contract to write for Penguin the 19th century volume in their 10-volume history of Europe. Or as my friend Ian Kershaw, who is writing the 20th century volume, said to me, it's a jolly good thing you're writing about something you know about, Richard. So, this is a kind of interesting project. It began about 21, 22 years ago, and Penguin had the idea of doing a series of relatively short general books on European history, which would not have footnotes, and they'd be about 120,000 words or so, about 300 pages. And we weren't actually given very large advances for it. And then just a few years after that, the history boom came along. The late 90s in Britain and in America as well, history suddenly became extremely fashionable for reasons that are very complex and difficult to understand. But suddenly history books became bestsellers. History programs are all over television, or as a television producer said, history is the new gardening. And we all then, of course, signed contracts for vastly more money for entirely different books, and rather forgot about the Penguin history of Europe until about just a few years ago. Several volumes then started to appear, particularly Tim Blanning's history of the period from 1648 to 1815, and Chris Wickham's wonderful volume on early medieval Europe. And by this time, part of the history boom was that the public liked blockbusters. The real bestsellers are 700 or 800 page books like Anthony Beevor's or Max Hastings' History of the Second World War. You can think of many of these things. So suddenly, Penguin were demanding that instead of 120,000 words, each volume should be about 280,000 words. And this rather sort of changed the game. But when 280,000 words, you can actually say quite a lot, and you can put in quite a lot of detail. Penguin got very excited when these other volumes started appearing and started putting a bit of pressure on us all to write. So they didn't pay us any more money. We by this time, I think we all began to think, well, this would be quite a good idea to get this series finished. Now, I'm going to talk about really how I'm going about writing the history of 19th century Europe and what the problems involved are and how I've tried to solve them. The first thing you've got to do is to reach some kind of view about where Europe is. It's not as simple as you might think. So in January 1986, the magazine History Today approached various eminent historians with the question, what is European history? And the first to respond, as was always quickest off the mark, was H.P. Taylor, who had written a number of influential works, including The Struggle for Mastery in Europe, 1848 to 1914, which is the first volume to appear in the Oxford History of Modern Europe. The other volumes, more than nearly 60 years later, are still in the process of appearing. He said, European history is whatever the historian wants it to be. It's a summary of the events and ideas, political, religious, specific, serious, romantic, prosaic, near at hand, far away, tragic, comic, significant, meaningless, anything else you want it to be. There's only one limiting factor. It must take place in or derive from the area we call Europe. But as I'm not sure what exactly that area is meant to be, I'm pretty well in a haze about the rest. These are rather unhelpful remarks, I think, typically for Taylor. History, of course, is more about more than events and ideas, and its core mission is not summarizing, but I think explaining. But I think Taylor was in some ways right to be a bit hazy about Europe as a geographical area, because, of course, Europe is not a continent, it's a concept. Or, as Peter Burke says, it's not so much a place as an idea. You might say it's the western part of the Eurasian continental continent, but its current definition has been arrived at over a long period of time. In the ancient world, Europe started off by referring to northern Greece, then the lands to the north of the Mediterranean, west of Anatolia. Only gradually did it gain further and better geographical contours. And of course, that's as maps began to emerge and travelers' tales began to be printed. So in the Middle Ages, the preferred term was, of course, the geographically indistinct one of Christendom. At times, Christendom could include the domains of the Coptic Church in North Africa, the Byzantine Christians in Anatolia, the Crusader states in the Middle East. And it's in the 15th century, with the failure of the attempt at reconciliation between Eastern Orthodoxy and Western Catholicism, attempted actually in the hotel we're staying in Florence, though it wasn't a hotel at that time, in 1439, that the concept of Christendom began to seem problematical. Missionary activities in America and Asia then undermined the utility of the idea of Christendom even further, because of course the proto-colonial mentality of the era refused to accept these far-flung regions as covered by the term Christendom. And then, perhaps most important of all, the deep divisions opened up by the Reformation made it impossible to conceive of Christendom as a unitary whole. Well, you could define Europe as the lands formerly part of the Roman Empire, but some noted this left Germany and Scandinavia outside the fold. And the eastward consolidation and expansion of the Tsarist Empire and the efforts of Peter the Great to adopt French and other Western European styles of government, administration, culture, and warfare led the geographers to revise the wisdom of the ancients. 1730, Philip von Strahlenberg, a Swedish geographer who'd served in the Russian army, published a survey of the Tsarist realm in which he argued that the boundary between Europe and Asia should be moved eastwards to the Ural Mountains. And by the end of the 18th century, when the Russian government put up a border post at which generations of convicts trudging their way in irons to Siberia would kneel and touch the earth, running the last crumbs of European soil through their fingers before relinquishing it forever, this came to be accepted as the boundary of Europe. It's the western part of the Eurasian landmass divided from it by the rest of it by the Ural Mountains, the Caspian Sea, and the mountains of the Caucasus. So that's what I mean generally by Europe. The second problem you have to think about, and one I want to spend rather more time talking about, is what do we mean by the 19th century? Now, the book I'm doing is a history of Europe from 1815 to 1914, following on sequentially in the Penguin History of Europe from Tim Blanning's The Pursuit of Glory, which covers the years 1648 to 1815. And there's actually a pragmatic reason for this, which was that I didn't actually want to write about the French Revolution, because it's just too complicated and you spend too much time writing about it, and I've spent my whole career trying to avoid the French Revolution. Originally, Penguin commissioned a volume from me covering 1789 to 1914, but I said to Tim, look, you know far more about the French Revolution than I do. You're much a bigger expert. Why don't you do that? And I'll start in 1815. And he was, I think, a bit flattered by this. So he said, all right, I'll do that then. So we moved the boundary up to 1815. But of course, while that's, you might say, a pragmatic reason, it took a long time actually to think about what really makes that period, 1815, 1914, a unitary whole. So as Blanning says in his own book, while every European history of Europe has to start at some arbitrary date, some dates are more arbitrary than others. And we speak habitually of the 19th century or the 20th century, but historians know that the period 1801 to 1900 has no real meaning beyond simply the chronological. If you want to write a chronicle in the style of Martin Gilbert, you can do that, but as history, it doesn't mean anything. And history, of course, is full of loose ends. Even the outbreak and conclusion of major wars so often provide the terminal dates for historians covering particular segments of the European past, including this one. To say the Battle of Waterloo to the outbreak of the First World War leave many issues unresolved, even in the field of politics and warfare. Many years ago, when politics and warfare, diplomatic and military and political history dominated the writing of history, periodization seemed obvious to most historians, even if they were already aware of the fact that the narrative of history moves across the great punctuation marks of wars, revolutions, and peace treaties with a callous disregard for the practical challenges faced by the historian, who after all had to start and stop somewhere. And this challenge has become even greater since history as a subject has expanded over the last half century or more to encompass all areas of human activity: society, culture, religion, philosophy, economy, everyday life, and so on. Because, of course, different aspects of history have different chronologies. A date that has meaning in political or military or diplomatic history may have very little, say, in social or economic history, or cultural history, or women's history. Long ago, the great French historian Fernand Braudel likened the movement of history to the movement of the sea, with the deepest layers of geography and landscape, such determining factors in societies before the industrialization of the world that lived off the land, with this deepest layer hardly moving at all. And then the middle level currents of economies and societies pushing forward slowly but discernibly nonetheless. And then at the top, the choppy waters and foamy waves of politics, powerless to influence the more profound movement of the sea below. And French historians following his lead came to talk of immobile history, which persisted well into modern times in many parts of Europe. So that despite the fall of the Ancien Régime in European political systems at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, the Ancien Régime économique et social persisted well into the second half of the 19th in some areas. And some historians, notably Arnaud Meyer in his book The Persistence of the Ancien Régime, have argued that the dominance of traditional aristocratic elites remained all the way up to the First World War, more or less causing it, in his view, so that not much of significance changed in the political sphere either. Well, that view has not been widely accepted by historians. Change there was in 19th century Europe, not just in politics, but in other spheres as well. And some have decided that the most meaningful period to study is the Age of Revolution, to quote the title of the first volume of Eric Hobsbawm's celebrated survey of the years 1789 to 1848, and then on to the 20th century. Now, the Age of Revolution, when Europe experienced repeated, radical, and violent political upheavals, lasted, in this view, from the French Revolution, the first one in 1789, up to the mid-century revolutions of 1848. The Europe of these years was, to quote the title of Jonathan Sperber's illuminating survey of the period from 1780 to 1850, Revolutionary Europe. And if you believe, as Hobsbawm did, that political upheavals are, in the last analysis, the product of social and economic forces, then this enables a historian to link together the many different dimensions of history in a single framework welded together by the concept of revolution. But this has become more difficult in the post-Marxist world of today, and there's a price to pay for choosing these years. For what came after was a very different Europe, one much less easy to conceptualize in a single framework. And not by chance, Sperber's follow-up volume to Revolutionary Europe has a wordy title that conveys, I'm sure unconsciously, difficulty he found in solving this problem. It's called Europe 1850 to 1914, Progress, Participation, and Apprehension. What does that actually mean? What does that do to pull it all together? Well, Hobsbawm went on to write two more volumes, The Age of Capital, covering the years 1848 to 1870, and The Age of Empire, taking the story up to the First World War. And anyone who tries to write the history of 19th century Europe has got to confront these three wonderful volumes, which tower over the literature on the subject. In all three cases, the binding concept makes sense, given the author's beliefs about how human history works. And of course, with his uncanny gift for conceptual innovation, Hobsbawm then went on to characterize the whole period covered by these three volumes as the long 19th century, the model which Penguin originally wanted me to follow, and a model followed by many textbooks and primers. For example, William Simpson and Martin Jones's useful study of Europe 1783 to 1914. Well, it seems to me here the problem is that the 19th century, seen in these terms, is a kind of broken-backed century. is divided into two very different halves by the 1848 revolutions. And not surprisingly, many historians covering the period from the Battle of Waterloo to the outbreak of World War I have given up the attempts to find any kind of conceptual unity and chosen titles such as R.S. Alexander's lucid recent political narrative of that period, Europe's Uncertain Path. And you have to ask, what does he mean by a path? From where to where? Uncertain, that means that nobody quite knew whether they were going or indeed where the path was. And you can carry on the metaphor if you like. It's clear it's rather desperate attempts to kind of give a title that pulls it all together. Well, I spent most of the 90s, insofar as I thought about this book at all, which wasn't very frequently, I have to admit, trying to think about how I could overcome these problems. And I couldn't really think of a way around it. And then in fact, Penguin themselves came along with the offer to write the history of Nazi Germany. So I got sidetracked. By the time I came back to this about 3 to 4 years ago, a way round these seemingly impassable conceptual obstacles had begun to appear. Now, through most of the 20th century, historians regarded the rise of nation-states and the conflicts between them as the central features of European history in the 19th century. The triumph of nationalism forged new political and cultural entities. It inspired revolts against large and, it seemed, outmoded multinational empires, the ones that eventually collapsed in 1918. It inspired revolts against oppression by other nationalities, or on the other hand, the ambition to achieve dominance over them. And this model of the nation-state was then exported across the globe in the 20th century, making its emergence in Europe in the 19th century seem even more important. And many historians saw this process to begin with in positive terms, putting celebratory accounts of the unification of Italy and Germany, the growth of Czech and Polish national consciousness, and other products of the age of nationalism at the center of their narrative. But of course, as national and ethnic rivalries spilled over into the huge conflict of the Second World War, from the perspective of the mid-20th century and later, the rise of nationalism appeared in a darker light. Now historians wanted to look back over the previous 150 years or so and trace the developments that culminated in the global conflict between nations centered on Europe. But since then, and much more importantly, I think, we've all realized that we're now living in an age of globalization, a relatively recent recognition. It wasn't, on the whole, I think, there when I signed the contract to write the book, but by the time I came back to it, it was. Globalization was the concept on everybody's lips. International institutions, global means of communication like the internet, multinational companies and their products, and many other influences crossed national boundaries, began to bind us all together as a global human community. I think in the last 15 years or so, this has altered our vision of the past, which historians have come to see increasingly in a global perspective. But of course, the idea that European history has to be seen in a global context is not new. And in his response to the History Today questionnaire in 1986, Marc Ferro took the opportunity to polemicize against what he called a concept of European history that's history seen solely with the eyes of Europe and with a European vision of history. This is indefensible because it serves to justify European supremacy. In particular, this concept, he thought, simply reflected the self-interest of the European bourgeoisie, of which, of course, historians were a part. In the post-colonial age, he warned European history, quoting here, European history can only have meaning insofar as it compares collective behavior in Europe and beyond, and without the rest of the world with which Europe must compare itself, European history will have no other function than to make Europe's presence invisible to the rest of the world and to isolate it still further. But it seemed to me Ferro's proposal was for actually more of a comparative global history, comparing Europe and other parts of the world, than for a global history that brought the different parts of the world together. And this development's happened only more recently, as historians have begun to examine the effects of empire on European economies, societies, cultures, and political systems, notably, but not exclusively, those of Britain. The global economic ties that bound Europe to other parts of the world in a nexus of mutual interaction. The genesis of colonial knowledge and its reception and influence in the colonizing nations. The rise of worldwide empire as a common European process rather than specific to any particular European nation. Historians, therefore, have been rewriting the history of individual European nations in a global context, emphasizing the effects of European diasporas, millions of Europeans who emigrated to other parts of the globe on the mother country, the infusion of European nationalism with elements of racial theory derived from the experience of colonization, the emergence of geopolitics as a key factor in relations between European states. And in fact, there are now, as I'm sure you know, two major books on the global history of the 19th century. One is by the several major books, actually. It's now, I think, three. I'm sounding like that famous sketch from Monty Python, aren't I? 3 reasons. No, 4 reasons. Those of you know Monty Python. Okay, there are several major books on the global history of the modern world. One's by the German historian Jürgen Osterhammel, whose The Transformation of the World is indeed truly global history. It's not a Eurocentric one like Hobsbawm's trilogy, which is centered on Europe and then looks at other parts of the world in so far as they were influenced by Europe. Covering the 19th century, Osterhammel's Transformation of the World, so far I think only available in German. It's about 1,500 pages long, so the translation is going to be a long time in coming. These chapters deal with an amazing variety of topics: memory and self-observation, time, space, mobility, living standards, cities, frontiers, power, revolution, the state, energy, work, communications, hierarchies, knowledge, civilization, religion, and so on. And its panoramic sweep and its originality in covering all these extraordinary different areas of human activities obviously had a strong influence on my own approach to European history in the 19th century. Now, the book by Osterhammel deliberately picks out common themes. It makes connections between different parts of the globe. It's shared developments and global processes. Osterhammel is a German historian whose speciality is Chinese history, so he has a kind of different perspective there. But it seems to me that in his work, global coverage is achieved at the expense of empirical detail, which is often pretty thin and always subsumed under wide-ranging generalizations. The book really doesn't give the reader the feel of the period. The author's argumentative and reflective presence eclipses that of the people who lived in the time he's writing about. So to provide that is to provide this feel, to provide to give voice or allow the people in the period I'm writing about to speak, to have lots of quotations, anecdotes, stories, life histories, and so on, is one of the main aims of my own book. That is because I think historical surveys spend too much time establishing the broad contours of interpretation without attempting to try and convey the lives and experiences of contemporaries. Of course, that's understandable in a brief textbook, whose ultimate purpose is to prepare students for examinations. But now I've got 280,000 words to play with, and I'm writing for general readers who may be new to the period. I've got the space to provide details to provide it that convey something of its flavour in all its mixture in the 19th century of strangeness, which one has to try and get across to general readers, and of course familiarity. And to try and avoid reducing contemporaries to kind of ventriloquist dummies by speaking through them with the voice of the historian, or reducing them to silence, as Osterhammel often does. Now, there are other no less ambitious works of global history written around the same time as Osterhammel's, which have offered a rather different approach to the 19th century. And these are based on the perception that this was the period, above all others, when Europe led the world and came to exercise domination over other parts of the globe. Historians like John Darwin, in his wonderful survey of global empires after Tamerlane, or Chris Bailey, in his equally impressive The Making of the Modern World, I think have shown, with a wealth of comparative evidence, the rough equality in almost every respect, from living standards to cultural achievements, of a whole range of civilizations across the world through most of the 18th century. The Mughal Empire in India, the Qing Empire in China, the great pre-colonial empires of Benin and its neighbours in Africa, the Ottoman Empire, other states, were roughly on a par with Europe around about 1750. But by 1815, this is no longer the case. Europe was forging ahead. Not, I think, as some historians, notably Neil Ferguson, have maintained because of its intrinsic cultural superiority, but because of some quite specific historical circumstances. And to analyse those, again, forms an important part of what I want to do. Europe maintained and extended its advantage on many fronts right up to the early years of the 20th century, though it was increasingly under attack. It's the First World War that really put it into question, and the Second World War that destroyed the supremacy, bringing down the global European empires in its aftermath. And this global hegemony is the main justification for taking the years 1815 to 1914 as a distinct and meaningful period of European history. So throughout the book, the global context, I hope, will be repeatedly emphasized. Events and processes on other continents will be brought into the narrative as a way of trying to explain or helping to explain what happened in Europe. So just as an obvious example, to start off with, in 1815, one of the most important things that happened in Europe was a Europe-wide famine, a series of famines, terrible poverty, starvation, and so on. And you can trace that to the eruption of a volcano in what is now Indonesia that covered the earth in a whole film of dust for 2 years and caused massive harvest failures. You can see this impact in many other different ways occurring through the century. Now, global history also means transnational history, though not necessarily with homogenizing tendencies that you can see sometimes in Osterhamel's work. Many histories of Europe have consisted largely of distinct narratives of different national histories. If you go back to 1927 and look at Grant and Temperley's Europe in the 19th century, it's that category. Simpson and Jones's textbook on the long 19th century, published in 2000, is in the same mould with separate chapters on France, Germany, Italy, Russia, and Habsburg monarchy. And the German historian Michal Salewski's History of Europe is actually entitled States and Nations from the Ancient World to the Present, and it presents a series of histories of its individual nations and states and the relations between them. So he kind of jumps from one country to another in an increasingly breathless fashion. The reader largely loses sight of what, if anything, bound Europe together as a whole, or what these states and nations had in common, or what wider processes affected them all. So the long-established and still incomplete Oxford History of Modern Europe that I've already mentioned takes a similar approach, with every volume devoted to a single country apart from the 4 that cover the relations between them. And it seems to me that there's not a lot of point in doing this. If I want to know about the history of France in the 19th century, I'll go to History of France. If I want to read a history of Europe, I want to read it for other reasons. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. But if you are writing a history of Europe, then I think you've got to do it a slightly different way. But of course, on the other hand, it's not possible to avoid dealing with key aspects of national history, particularly when you come to discussing political developments. So you've got the war for Greek independence, for example, the revolutionary conflicts in Spain, the abolition of serfdom in Russia, unification of Italy, rise of socialism in Germany, and so on. You've got to give detailed coverage to each of those. And then there's a further difficulty, which is that research has been carried out overwhelmingly within national boundaries. So statistical information on the 19th century and since, until very recently, has been collected by national bodies. So you can't really avoid that, but what I've tried to do is to bring out the international, where appropriate, the global dimension of these topics. So, for example, the involvement of many nationalities in the movement for Greek independence, or Italian unification. The movement of Greek independence, of course, is itself led by a former Russian foreign minister. The common features of serfdom, its abolition across wide swathes of northern and eastern Europe. So you can see the abolition of serfdom in Tsarist Russia as part of a much wider process that stretches across the century from Prussia in the early part of the 19th century right up to the lamentable failure of the Austrian government to abolish serfdom in Bosnia up to 1914. Or the impact of the loss of colonies on the Americas, in the Americas on Spanish domestic politics, or the Europe-wide participation in all kinds of movements, socialism seeing itself explicitly as a movement transcending national boundaries, and so on. What I don't want to do is to construct a retrospective historical justification for the European Union, as was attempted not so long ago with the textbook History of Europe, co-authored by teams of German and French historians and published simultaneously in both languages for use in schools. The aim of that was, as an official spokesman said, to contribute to a common European identity and knowledge about what is important for European culture and history. In fact, perhaps unsurprisingly, the textbook had a rather narrow concept of Europe, focusing particularly on France and Germany. It tended to gloss over the more difficult parts of the European past in favour of accentuating positive shared aspects of European, or rather Western European culture. But conflict between nation states, of course, was a key part of the continent's history in the 19th century. You just can't ignore it in the interests of European harmony. And you can't confine the history of Europe to events and processes in a few selected major states. So I'm making a conscious effort to bring in what you might call the periphery, from Iceland to Bosnia, Estonia to Portugal. And Norman Davies, in his very lively Europe history, insisted on the enormous weight of territory and population carried by Eastern Europe, above all in the 19th century, and the Russian Empire. And he tried to express this by printing all his maps of Europe sideways on, presenting the reader with a Russian Empire at the bottom of the page that filled almost half the page, and the rest of Europe was kind of in the top half. And certainly, I'm not going to print my maps that way, but that's something I want, again, to take due account of, and simply the sheer weight of the Tsarist Empire and Eastern Europe in terms of population, geographical area, and many other things. So, an approach that, as far as possible, is transnational. And I'm conscious, obviously, in doing this, that I'm actually following the footsteps of Lord Acton, who was Regius Professor in Cambridge in the 1890s, founder of the Cambridge Modern History. In his plan for this ambitious enterprise, Acton told his contributors, the ones who are going to write the chapters, universal history is not the sum of all particular histories. It ought to be contemplated first in its distinctive essence as Reformation, Renaissance, religious wars, absolute monarchy, revolution, etc. The several countries may or may not, he said, contribute to feed the main stream, but attention ought not to be dispersed by putting Portugal, Transylvania, Iceland side by side with France and Germany. My plan, he said, is to break through the mere juxtaposition of national histories and to take in, as far as may be, what is extraterritorial and universal. And that's an approach I've tried to follow, am trying to follow in the book. And Acton, of course, born in Naples to a Catholic family, living in Italy, half German, educated in France, living in England, was kind of the epitome of a multicultural figure. He didn't like nationalism. He saw European history in the round. I think now not because he was, as Hugh Trevor Roper once remarked, one of the great Victorian misfits. On the contrary, he's writing in an age, in the 1890s, when globalization was actually sweeping across the continent, with growing global interlinkages between national economies and the enormous number of international organizations and communication networks of recent creation in the late 19th century very much in evidence. This world would vanish in 1914 and would not be effectively recreated until the late 20th century. Still, Acton's approach reflected his extraordinary percipience, I think, evident perhaps too in his dark forebodings about the role that might be played in the future by German nationalism. It's not inspired by some romantic nostalgia for empires that were about to disappear. And of course, famously, Acton never really wrote anything. He spent all his time accumulating an enormous library of books without ever thinking he was ready to write one himself. And he died before he could realize his ambitious plan for the Cambridge Modern History. When it was eventually published under the much more efficient but much less imaginative editorship of Sir Adolphus Ward, the Cambridge Modern History did indeed largely adopt a country-by-country approach, reflecting very much the nation-based vision in which a younger generation wrote and studied European history. Acton was a peripheral figure, perhaps not so much to his age as to the historical profession, which had of course grown up earlier in the century as part of the emergence of national consciousness and identity, and in each country serving the function of excavating and legitimating the national past. So historians of Sir Adolphus Ward's generation concentrated their attention on their own nation's past. This had not always been so. In particular, the 18th century Enlightenment strengthened the idea of Europe as the heir of classical civilization and put this into effect in broad histories of the continent, reflecting perhaps the unity of the Republic of Letters of the 18th century. Voltaire noted that all European states shared the same principles of public law and politics. No European, wrote Edmund Burke, can be a complete exile in any part of Europe. So uniting European culture was not only the legacy of ancient Greece and Rome, but also the dominant model of French civilization imitated and adopted across Europe from Edinburgh to St. Petersburg. And the concept of Europe resting on a shared legacy of civilization derived ultimately from the ancient world, from Greece and Rome, was articulated in probably the first genuine attempt at European history by the Scottish intellectual William Robertson, The History of the Reign of the Emperor Charles V, published in 1769. Robertson was the first to attempt the history of Europe as a whole. He saw the era as the founding period of a modern secular Europe, creating a great European family of nations, whose relations with one another were governed, he said, by the great system of the balance of power. And in the era of Charles V, the European feudal nobility, he argued, declined in power and was replaced by the emergence of the modern state. The Reformation and the ensuing religious conflicts were, in his view, expressions of a primitive and emotional state of mind, which, with the help of the modern state, had been replaced in his own day, his own period of the Enlightenment, by politeness, sensibility, good manners, and civilization. And we're talking here, of course, about small, educated elite. And with the rise of nation-states, this idea of a common European culture deriving from the ancient Greek and Latin classics receded from view. After the end of the Second World War, the division of Europe by the Iron Curtain made it even more difficult to revive. It's only with the fall of communism, the extension of the European Union to much of Eastern Europe, and the renewed onward march of globalization, that the possibility of writing a real European history, I think, re-emerged. And you can't really write it any longer, as Grant and Temperley and their counterparts elsewhere have tried to do, as a history of politics and international relations. Since the 1970s, at the latest, historical investigation has expanded its field of vision until it encompasses, as I've said, almost every aspect of human activity in the past. And already in the 60s, Hobsbawm's Age of Revolution had chapters on religion, ideology, science, the arts, the economy, and much else besides. Subsequent historical research has extended its range even further, as Osterhammer's list of topics suggests. Most recently, for example, history of landscape, the environment. Hobsbawm was able to bind this all together through an overarching master narrative that placed the development and determining influence of capitalism at its core. But the historians of the early 21st century, in a time when the grand master narratives have fallen into disrepute, have no such luxury. The most we can do, as Tim Blanning says, is to trace lines of development. It means identifying survivals from previous ages, like serfdom, seeing how they were transformed and changed, eventually disappeared, just as much as it means identifying the beginnings of developments that continue to affect us, such as environmental pollution. Two of Blanning's main lines of development, what he calls the relentless march of the states to hegemony and the emergence of a new kind of cultural space, the public sphere. So it's impossible to quote Blanning without imitating the way he speaks. It's just impossible. He sort of writes as he speaks, if for those of you who know him. These developments continued through the 19th century, and they achieved an expansion and dominance that were almost unthinkable in the 18th. The state structures of Restoration Europe would in some ways still have been familiar to the continent's inhabitants of 50 years before, although appearances in many ways were deceptive. The power and intrusiveness of the state was still relatively limited. Popular participation in politics is still minimal, despite the still vivid example of the events of the French Revolution. The public sphere was still confined mostly to a small stratum of the educated and the literate and their institutions, from periodical publications to coffee houses or reading clubs. By 1914, the state had been transformed, with universal male and in some parts of the continent even female suffrage and direct popular participation in the shaping of national, regional and local policy on the one hand, not least through organised political parties, and a vast expansion in the control the state could exercise over its citizens in areas ranging from education to health, military service to social work on the other. The linked processes of the improvement of communications and the growth of the economy delineated by Blanning accelerated faster in the 19th century than anyone in the 18th century could have imagined. In 1815, the railway, the telegraph, the steamship, the photograph were barely visible over the historical horizon. By 1914, Europe was entering the age of the telephone, the motor car, the radio, the cinema, the aeroplane. In 1815, we're still in the age of the Newtonian understanding of the universe, of representational art, of classical music. By 1914, Einstein has propounded his theory of relativity, Picasso has painted his cubist work, Schoenberg has composed the first atonal music. On the other hand, of course, this is also in an even more immediate sense Europe entering the age of the machine gun, the tank, the submarine and the fighter plane. The first aerial bombardment of an enemy force was recorded in 1911 in the Italian invasion of Libya. The first concentration camps had been opened in South Africa by the British and Southwest Africa by the Germans. And such developments foreshadowing the enormous violence and destructiveness of the first half of the 20th century stand, I think, as a warning against treating the 19th century as most of its inhabitants treated it, an era of linear progress and open-ended improvement. Progress had its price, and between 1914 and 1945, Europe paid it. I'm picking up here on the themes that are raised in Tim Blanning's work, because although, of course, each volume in this series is going to be read separately, nevertheless, I think it's useful to try and look at what the previous volume says and how it approaches the subject. And Blanning ends on a very gloomy note as far as the condition of life of the vast majority of Europeans is concerned, with the beginnings of industry and the effects of rapid population growth, bringing what he calls a new kind of poverty, not a sudden affliction by famine, plague or war, but a permanent state of malnutrition and underemployment. And the 19th century, as he suggests here, I think implicitly, was relatively free of major European wars. And one of the things I have to do, of course, is to explain why. And as in so many other aspects of the period, the changed relationship of Europe with the rest of the world was an important determining factor here. In other words, if you look at the wars of the 18th century, including the Napoleonic Wars, these tend to be global wars. And if you go to the 20th century, again, you have global warfare. The 19th century wars were not global. They were, insofar as they happened at all, confined to Europe. And their relative infrequency is another product of this absence of a global dimension to conflict between nations. And the famines, notably in Ireland, Scandinavia, Russia, and plagues too, particularly in the periodic outbursts of cholera that swept the continent. But these are neither so frequent nor so devastating as in some previous eras, or indeed as in the 20th century, at least the first few decades. By the end of the century, they'd largely vanished from Europe. It didn't mean, of course, that social, economic, and other forms of inequality vanished along with them. So running through the book will be the representation of the shifting contours of inequality in the 19th century, with older forms such as serfdom on the land giving way to new ones like wage labour in the factory, with equality and inequality within Europe related to inequality between Europe and other parts of the world. Again, cholera is a very obvious example which comes to Europe from northern India as with the British conquest of northern India after 1815, facilitating the whole movement of disease across through Afghanistan, Persia, and Russia to Europe, known indeed as Asiatic cholera. So the 19th century, you could see optimistically, is the age of emancipation, with millions of people being given greater equality of status, including in some respects the majority of the population, women. And again, I have to explore these enormous changes and how they came about. But of course, equality and emancipation are only ever partial and conditional, as the years after 1914 were to show. So I need also to describe the limitations which they experienced. Now, arguments and disputes about inequality were at the centre of 19th century European politics. And building on the legacy of ideas bequeathed by the French Revolution, increasing numbers of political thinkers and actors began to conceive and try to implement ways and means of overcoming the inequalities they witnessed. And the spectrum of solutions ranged from aristocratic paternalism and the sense of noblesse oblige at one extreme to the anarchist attempt to destroy the state at the other. Socialism, liberalism, communism, nationalism, many other doctrines prioritized one or another method of freeing people from the yoke of oppression and exploitation according to how they defined it. Those who put order and hierarchy first recognized they couldn't survive just by clinging to the old order, or at least most of them did. So they too became participants in the great debate on inequality. And religions offered a variety of solutions rooted in the temporal world, or advocated escape from it altogether. What these many different strands of thought and action had in common, I think, was a desire to acquire and wield power so that these ideas could be put into action. And again, thinking about a title for the book, it occurred to me that while Tim Blanning calls his history of Europe from 1648 to 1815 the pursuit of glory, signifying the priorities of the dominant political elites of the age, I decided then to call the book The Pursuit of Power. And this pursuit of power permeated European society in the 19th century. States grasped for world power, governments reached out for imperial power, armies built up their military power, revolutionaries plotted to grab power, political parties campaigned to come to power. Bankers and industrialists strove for economic power. Labour unions went on strike for more power over wages, conditions of work, their own lives. Modernist artists challenged the power of the academies. Medical researchers reached out in the laboratories for power over disease. Engineers and planners extended humankind's power over nature. And in a different sense, scientists and mechanics devised and exploited new sources of power, from steam to electricity, from the power loom to the internal combustion engine. Power could be formal or informal, could be exercised through violence or persuasion, could be consensual or majoritarian. It might take economic or social or cultural or political or religious or organizational or many other forms. But as the 19th century progressed, people increasingly prioritized it over glory, honor, and comparable values, which had been dominant for many centuries before. And how and why this came to be, and how power relations in Europe, within Europe affected and were affected by power relations between Europe and the rest of the world, is a central theme of the book. So far, I've managed to write 2 chapters completed. So one is on politics up to 1830, and the other one covers society and economies in the same period, and in some aspects right up to the end of the century. I've got 6 more to do. I've done more or less 2 of them and bits of another one. So I've still got a long way to go. And no doubt, as I go through writing, all of these ideas will change and be modified and so on, particularly, I hope, as a result of contribution, discussion, and debate, which I now invite you to engage in. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard, for telling us about this extremely ambitious project, and also for your imitations of Tim Blanning, which I greatly enjoyed. While everyone just thinks about what they're going to ask and questions that I want to ask you something very obvious, okay, as a kind of to kick it all off. And that is, I was listening to it, and I was thinking to myself, it's impressively broad. It reflects what I like about it. I mean, in short, is that it is what you're proposing to do both reflects present day concerns, or the concerns of historians, as well as actually not jettisoning older preoccupations and concerns and problems. The one thing it seems that it also reflects is the fact that you're a Brit, okay? And I was very struck by the fact that everybody you quoted approvingly, actually almost everyone you quoted, was in some way either a British or a British-based historian. And the only people that you didn't, who weren't, were Osterhammel, who you were pretty rude about, and these French and German Euro historians who you're even ruder about. And so I'm thinking this is very English, okay? What you're coming out of, the kind of the context, your inspirations, your parameters, the people that you're dialoguing with, is very British. And I guess therefore my question is extremely simple, which is: do you think this matters? Do you think this is a problem?
Do I think being British is a problem?
No. Do you think that you're no? Well, that obviously is, right. We all know that. No, but do you think it's a problem that your parameters and your concerns and your inspirations are, in a sense, all coming from the sort of the English-speaking world, and actually mostly Britain? I mean, but basically these texts that you quoted, they're all in some way or another have sort of British historians. Or British-based historians as their reference?
Not really. I mean, it could be interesting if you could cite me other perspectives from other parts of the world. I mean, but it does seem to me, and I've been arguing this for a while now, that British historians do, along with American historians, have an extremely broad European, even global perspective, that for all kinds of historical reasons, we do seem to write a lot about the history of other countries and other parts of the world. Empire, obviously, is a central concern of historians like, let's say, John Darwin, for example. And there is a growing debate about empire, but empire is now coming to be seen by British historians as a general European phenomenon. So the way in which increasingly people are approaching this in Britain is not to study the British Empire per se, but it's alongside the French empires. It's the next largest one, Spanish and Portuguese and Dutch in the early modern period, the short-lived German Empire, and so on. So, and the American Empire in the 20th century. So I think that we do have a very broad perspective, one which is going to come to an end before very long, as the knowledge of foreign languages in Britain dies out, and if Michael Gove's new history curriculum, which is going to focus exclusively on British history, comes to fruition, we'll have generations growing up who know nothing about history of anywhere apart from Britain. But at the moment, for various historical reasons, I do think we have a very broad perspective. So I don't see it as a problem. I mean, my own intellectual formation is because of my specialization on Germany. It's been partly British and partly German. And of course, the history of Germany is something that's very intensively studied in the United States. So that I don't have a kind of, I hope, a kind of just a British perspective on these things. But as far as I do think it's an unusually broad one.
Okay. Yep. Thank you. Hang on. Who would like to?
I mean, you must agree, because I'm talking here to a British historian of Italy. So.
No, I just wanted to hear your view. I wanted to hear you defend it. I think Federico wants to ask a question. Is there anyone?
Several, in fact.
Okay, well, why don't you go?
Yeah, the first question is sort of pure curiosity, whether you intend to, or if one of your narrative threads is going also to be around an assessment of Europe becoming more or less homogeneous. Do you see any process of Europeanizations, to adopt the jargon that applies to the last 50 years, or this is not a dimension that is of any interest to you? more or less similar, equal, etc. Second problem, if you anchor, which it seems to me is a much bigger problem in European historiography about the 19th century in general, you anchor your book also to a notion of global hegemony, which is rather obvious. But at the same time, your story ends at the very moment in which the major economic and industrial power in the world is no longer a European one, is the US. Does that matter? Is that something that you want to in any way discuss, integrate? Obviously, the US remain, I presume, on the margins of your field of vision, especially the field of writing. But this seems to me an issue that is tricky in a way. Global hegemony peaks, global hegemony is on the way to its end, if it's the main explanatory factor of the century. And the second point is, again, to a certain extent related to global hegemony and also to economic growth and social change in Europe. Where do you place the massive migration out of Europe, which is not a phenomenon of colonization, but is a phenomenon of poverty and escape for Europe, for the people who do migrate, particularly to the Americas?
Okay. Obviously, you can't simply say Europe is becoming more homogeneous in a time when nation states are becoming more important and eventually more antagonistic towards each other. But you can see a lot of cultural transfer going on. And I think, for example, the very intensive cultural transfers that go on between Britain and Germany up to 1914 have in some ways made it more difficult to understand the outbreak of the First World War. So those are processes that continue. And if you look at the colonies, again, you find in many colonies national differences disappear. So in Cameroon, for example, where there is a tiny, just a couple of hundred Europeans, it's a German colony, but there are a lot of British merchants there. The language that is used is actually Pidgin English to communicate with the Africans. And there are the English all go to celebrate the Kaiser's birthday. They always talk about themselves as Europeans in that situation. So there are significant ways in which there's a kind of European identity in opposition to a colonized other. There are, if you look, for example, at industrialization, you can see industrialization. It's not a kind of homogenizing process, but it's not a process that takes place within individual nation states, although in order to get an information about it, you have to go and look at books covering industrialization in France and Russia and Germany and so on. It actually takes place, as Sidney Pollard argued some time ago, in regions. So if you look at the Northwest European coalfield, for example, you've got a very similar kind of social and economic processes taking place in Western Germany, Northeastern France and Southern Belgium. So and you have so there are complex processes going on, which in the end you can say you have to look at different levels, and the national level is just simply not satisfactory just to stick with that. As far as global hegemony is concerned, I don't think Europe. I mean, it's challenged. It begins to be challenged before 1914, but I say not very much actually. In terms of European empires, they felt themselves to be particularly secure in 1914. In terms of the economy, America, of course, is forging ahead, but this doesn't translate in any way into political power until well into the 20th century. And Americans come in the First World War, but then they go out again after the First World War with isolationism. Does it matter? No, because Europe, the US becomes the world power after my period, and again, that's one of the key things. You can see World War I. I mean, it's become a bit of a cliche, but it's not going to stop me using it. To see World War I as colonialism turned inwards, you can see racism that comes to permeate a lot of European thinking by 1914. Again, it's derived from the colonial experience. So. And in some ways strengthens the idea of European hegemony by 1914. Migration out of Europe, well, again, you can see this in two ways. Of course, what do the migrants do when they get to America or Latin America or Australia and so on? How far is their consciousness still European? How far does it become a mixture, a sort of synthesis of European and a hyphenated consciousness, as the Americans say? But also more, so we have to deal to some extent with that. But more interest, in a way, to me, is the role of migration and its impact of people leaving. Say, hundreds of thousands who left Italy in the decade before 1914. What's their impact on Italy itself? People sending back money, people coming back, transfer of ideas, all sorts of things like that. So I think migration's important. From my perspective as a historian of Europe, particularly on its impact in Europe, say out migration, its impact on Europe.
I know Laura, I think, is the next one.
Yeah, I have a much smaller question. It seemed, first of all, I want to thank you for this talk, which is I admire your comments that you've taken on such an ambitious project.
It's just very daunting when you say something like that.
It's a daunting project, but it sounds like you got it well. I was curious about some of the things that you were saying about the evolution of the state. You want me to speak into this thing? Oh, okay. It sounded to me like you were interested in tracing, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were interested also in tracing how the state's relationship to populations alters across the 19th century and the particular kinds of responsibilities that the state begins to see towards its populations, questions of health, welfare, education, et cetera. And it seems to me that once you get involved in that, you get also involved in a story of the state of different European state struggles with somebody else who's already occupying that terrain, which are the various churches. And the fact that the church is in some sense a hierarchical and power political institution that is already occupying a terrain and performing functions that the state increasingly comes to see as things it should be doing, notably education, but also healthcare. So I was wondering sort of what you intended to do with religion, and particularly with religion, not just the question of people's faith, individual faith, religious experience, but also the question of the church as a kind of a power political institution. So that's my question.
This is a bit I haven't got to yet. I'm going to have a chapter that will include belief. But I would see, in terms of European history, obviously, if you're going to, my section on religion is going to deal with all the great religions of Europe. That's to say, Protestantism, Catholicism, the Orthodox religion, Judaism, and Islam, because Islam, of course, through the influence of the Ottoman Empire, has a huge effect on Albania, Bosnia, and some other parts of Eastern Europe and the Balkans. So I need to cover all of those, really. I think what I got to so far is looking at the relations between church and state and poor law and poor relief, where because of the urbanization of poverty, if you like, in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, you have in many parts of Europe a breakdown of the church charity, which has been dominant up to then, simply cannot cope, and you get voluntary associations. It depends where you look. In Russia, the voluntary associations are all set up by the Tsar, in fact. But when you get further west, because they are genuinely voluntary and they're often secular. So there's a kind of secularization process going on in terms of poor relief that ends up with the state, with the welfare state, at least in its embryonic form, pioneered by Germany and also in Britain, of course. So, but that's as far as I've got in looking at that. It's obviously a key aspect of the century. And again, I've actually written a section about conflicts between religion and science in mid-century, particularly centered, of course, upon Darwin and Darwinism and how that works. So this is about as far as I've got there, but it's obviously a very important aspect, and particularly, of course, in popular religion and popular belief, what the churches like to call superstition, but in fact across the peasant world, which is the majority of Europeans live in right through the century, everyday religion often takes forms that the church would not recognize as religion. So all of those things will be somehow thrown into the pot, and I hope come out in some kind of coherent form at the end.
Okay, thank you. We've got, and then, I don't even know. Fabrizio. Okay. And I actually would also like to encourage some of the researchers to ask questions too.
I was going to ask you a question about the Ottoman Empire, but you ended up mentioning it in your last answer, so I'll skip that and move on to another one.
That's a relief.
Yeah, well, we have an expert in the Ottoman Empire here, Professor Islamoglu from Turkey, so maybe we can expand on that later. I wanted to see if we could ask you to give us a little more of a sense of what's driving it all along. Now, there are many themes you could pick up. You've mentioned a lot of them: migration, science, religion now, and so forth. And as you say, they all have their micro-narratives, which intersect with each other, but not necessarily lead in the same direction. But you are finishing in 1914, and as you mentioned, this is the necessary telos, set to some extent by the fact that this is the typically short 19th century, and you've got to end somewhere. But it's not an arbitrary number or date, it's 1914. I mean, is there a sense of that the developments you're tracing, for example, technology, lead to developments that end up killing people in the First World War? Guns, machine guns in particular, tanks, gas. So that which was envisaged in the Enlightenment to liberate people, the project of emancipation, ends up actually becoming those which enslave and terrorize Europeans. You mentioned you hinted at the boomerang effect, which I think it was Rosa Luxemburg who first mentioned when she talked about Europe barbarizing itself in the First World War. This is when you mentioned the colonial racism coming back into Europe. That's something that Hannah Arendt picked up as well. She often talked about the boomerang effect. So these are at a meta-historical level, I suppose, these questions. It's not about individual developments, it's about where you're taking the reader to. In terms of drama, is this a story of catastrophe after high hopes at the beginning of the 19th century, or one of some missed opportunities? It's sort of that kind of thing.
Well, yes, thanks. I was trying to take some notes there. It's all very useful. Yeah, I intend to make the last line of the book, the great quote by Sir Edward Grey: "I see the lights going out all over Europe. They shall not be lit again in our lifetime," on the outbreak of the First World War. Because you have to point forward to the very, very different circumstances of the history of Europe from 1914 onwards. But it's not a telos. In other words, you can't. It's a big mistake, I think, also in the view of recent research, to take 1914 as the point at which everything is leading up to. There's been a lot of research, I was saying, on cultural transfer between England and Germany, for example. It's extremely intense. A long time ago, it was shown that economic relations between European countries were intensifying in this period. And more recently, we've, I think, been shown that kind of hatred of European hatreds was something that broke out in 1914. The idea that the Germans hated the British hated the French. Sorry, the British hated, they always hate the French, but the British hated the Germans. All this sort of rhetoric of extreme violent nationalism. This is a product of the First World War. It's not something that leads up to it. And something I don't think you can now look at the whole period in the terms of, say, Paul Kennedy's book, The Rise of the Anglo-German Antagonism. So it's kind of made it more difficult in some ways. But I think to point forward, that the drama will end with some stuff I've already written about the Balkan Wars starting in mid-1870s and leading up to the First World War, and the influence of colonial mentalities and conflicts and so on, and all of that. So, there is a problem about, of course, integrating all the different bits. So the structure of it is, there's a political chapter 1, which goes up to 1830. There's a political chapter 3, which goes from 1830 to 1870. And there's a final, probably 2 chapters that take empire and politics from 1870 up to 1914. And interspersed with those are 3 or 4 thematic chapters that cover the whole, that range over very long periods of time. So, for example, in chapter 2, where I start every chapter with a personal story. So chapter 1 is of one of Napoleon's soldiers coming back from Moscow and trying to reintegrate, and it's from his memoirs and so on. Chapter 2 begins with the memoirs of the Russian serf, and it leads into serfdom, because the emancipation of the serfs is one of the really huge, vastly important processes in the 19th century, which I think a lot of people who come to the 19th century without knowing much about it just simply don't realize how widespread serfdom was and what an extraordinary process the emancipation was. And to cover that, I have to go right through to the end of the century, because that's how long it all took, and the consequences, and peasant revolts and so on, and then famines right up to the end of the century and all that stuff. On the other hand, industrialization there, I just go from up to 1848. So there's a sense in which the telos of that chapter is both 1848 and also 1914, because what Princip, the assassin of Franz Ferdinand, says at his trial is, I came to hate the Austrians because serfdom, they did not abolish serfdom in my country. I loathe them. I've seen everybody in my family suffering, and this is my blow against the Austrians. So, there are kind of these, I try and bring out all these connections without making everything inexorably lead up to the end, because, as I said, you just have to accept there are all these loose ends lying around.
So as a caveat, I'm not an historian, and I teach comparative law here at the UI. I'm interested in 2 questions. The first one is about integration. And so what I would like to ask you is, compared to the 18th and 20th century, do you consider the 19th century a century of European disintegration or European integration? So what kind of continuity or discontinuity when it comes to European integration you see between the 18th, 19th, and 20th century? And the second question is about power. I suppose the conventional story is that the 19th century is a century where political power is being reallocated from civil society to states. But there are many, I think, reservations in looking at it this way. And so I was wondering whether you could tell me or us, what are the areas of political power that were still preserved for non-state actors in the 19th century?
Okay, well, integration, disintegration, of course, it depends where you look. So there are simultaneous and contradictory processes going on at different levels. So you can certainly see at one level economic integration happening across Europe with industrialization, intensification of trade, and so on. You can see certainly the idea of a common European civilization based on the classics becomes much less important as different national cultures start to introduce education systems that get away from that and start teaching their own history, their own culture, their own language, their own literature, and so on. You can see, on the other hand, cultural exchanges going. So there are a lot of complicated processes, which makes it, on politics in terms, well, I think integration, in terms of integration, there's certainly, again, at different levels. So there is, of course, the idea of the Workers' International. So the Second International is at least on paper, is an integrated European process. There are many social movements. Take the feminist movement, for example, where there are multiple connections between different countries. There are international congresses, international meetings. There are, in the area of communications, is a massive area of integration, because if you take, for example, the World Time Conference of 1884, which draws up and this is actually a good example. 1884, there's a conference, everybody agrees on the world's time zones, on the international date line, and the fact that Greenwich Mean Time is the kind of 0 hour, as it were. Everybody except the French, of course, who don't really play ball and try and do their own thing. But the imperative for a homogenization of global time centered on Europe because of European hegemony is massive, especially when you have the telegraph, the telephone, and other means of communication. So there's a kind of integration that goes on there. On the other hand, and also if you look at colonies, there's a kind of simultaneous common attitude of European political elites towards the rest of the world, which is an attitude of superiority, conquest, exploitation, all the rest of it. But the growth of conflict between European countries as they began to jockey for position within that European framework of world hegemony. So I think there are a lot of interesting processes at different levels. I still have to work out the effect they had on each other, obviously. As far as power goes, state power and non-state power. I mean, power is a kind of convenient way of trying to pull it all together. One of the ways of putting it together. But there are obviously different kinds of power: social power, cultural power, economic power, which are not necessarily state power at all.
Here again, I focus on political power.
Well, in political power, I just think I think one has to look at power as something that is multidimensional and operates in many different ways. So it's certainly the case that in the 1820s, the state has very limited power. You can see this, for example, in terms of combating disease. The state simply doesn't have the resources to stop epidemics. It does by the end of the century. You've got cordon sanitaire, you've got disinfection, you've got this stopping the movement of goods and so on. So the state's power over disease changes. I think it's just, I think it's just too narrow to see power in terms of politics, constitutions, parties, rulers. I think you have to look at it in a much broader way. Certainly, if you're doing a project like this, where you have to encompass all these other dimensions as well.
Because I know we've got. I'm not saying anything that needs to. I will. Okay. Well, then, but please, can you try to think of a question? Yeah, go ahead. And then I know there's email.
Thank you. First, I would like to express my big admiration to your topic. It seems to me enormous, and I think it will require not only an enormous amount of intellectual work, but also physical energy and writing mastery. And my question is whether you still use archival research of primary sources for your work. So this is my first question. Second is linked to actually your introduction. You mentioned many aspects, of course. You mentioned also Russian, the big empires, but you didn't mention Austrian Empire and Austro-Hungarian Empire. And of course, this was a huge phenomenon in 19th century. So I would like to ask you also about this and how you plan to incorporate all this like big empire in your work. And lastly, about concept of Central Europe, because you mentioned Eastern Europe. But of course, in 19th century, there was a strong Central Europe and like incorporation of Central European area into Eastern Europe came only with bipolar division of the world. So I would like to ask you how you are going to take this. Thank you.
Okay, there's interesting archives. No way, absolutely not. That would be just far too much. I mean, there is some. I use newspapers, for example. That you can get a lot of information on newspapers. where I have a chapter that's almost done on, it's called The Conquest of Nature, in homage to David Blackbourne's book, but it covers all of Europe. And there I deal with the relationship of human society to the natural world through the 19th century. And so you can usually get a lot from newspaper reports of various aspects of that relationship. So, like Tim Blanning, I remember him saying to me, and he's writing the book, he said, I've written 50 pages on hunting. My editor thinks it's too much. And of course, as Tim is very enthusiastic about huntsman himself, but he doesn't like to admit it. And it was indeed cut. And I've written rather too much on wolves and bears, I think, on the transition from bear hunting in the early 19th century to the teddy bear in the early 20th century. But as a symbol for the growing consciousness of mastery over nature and so on. But, so that I can get a lot of detailed information at that level, but not archives. That will be just far too much. Even if I had a team of researchers, I would not send them into the archives. I'd have them use more easily accessible material. In terms of Austria-Hungary, it's there. Yes, it's there. Don't worry. It's because I try and bring in to the narrative parts of Europe that are often not very much written about. So, for example, in writing about tourism, which I've also done already, it's a kind of section of a later chapter to do with communications. I'm very careful to use relatively recent literature on Eastern European tourism to the West, not just British tourism to the continent, as it were. And in looking at the things like famine. I mean, of course, I bring in the Hungarian famine in the early, the 1815-16, as well as the Swedish famines of the 1860s and so on. So I do bring in all that part of Europe very, very consciously, and particularly, of course, Romania, where if you're dealing with the emancipation of serfdom and you carry on the consequences, they are the most damaging for the peasantry anywhere in Europe, in Romania, leading to the biggest of all the peasant revolts in Europe, which in my period in Romania in 1907. So it's there. And when I come to deal with power, obviously in the 1820s is the political bit I've written. Metternich plays a role, the Austrian Empire, and so on. So that comes back, and particularly in dealing with the Balkan Wars and the origins of the First World War. So it's there. In terms of Central Europe, I think it's a bit, I'm quite wary. Central Europe is a very politically loaded concept of Mitteleuropa, and it becomes an ideological sort of football around the turn of the 19th, 20th centuries. And since I'm trying to look at processes that go across Europe, I'm trying not to use these very specific geographical terms. Nevertheless, of course, you have to use terms like Central Europe, East Central Europe, West Europe, East Europe, and so on. So I do sort of throw those around a bit in a rather non-specific way. But I think you've made me think now I better go back and look what I've written and be careful to sort of see how I use these terms. So that's a very useful question.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much also, because I think you very well filled the desire or the spirit of the Europe and the World Forum. One of them is precisely to problematize the way we write the history of Europe, and I think that in that sense your presentation was an excellent I would say an excellent set of ideas to discuss precisely about that. So thank you very much for that. I wanted to come back to Lucy's question. I mean, she's British, so she could allow herself to make the question. I know, but we could discuss about that if you want.
We're all the same. English speakers.
I understand. We can discuss about that. Anyway, I know that she is Irish, more or less aware of the problem. But I mean, she can allow herself to make that question in a way which is so direct. Let me put the question in a different way, which is not exactly that, and which has to do precisely on how to write the history of Europe. To what extent you think that there is a problem of perspective when we write any historian from any particular area of Europe, I mean, not British, Spanish, Italian, etc. There is a different perspective. It's not a problem, but to what extent the perspective in which we write the history of Europe, or from which we write the history of Europe, can affect the type of history of Europe we write, and more particularly to what extent we historians are going to be able to involve in our history of Europe to the public of the different nations and areas of Europe. It's a different way to ask the same question, which is less personal, but I think can provide us with some thoughts to think about. My second question has to do a bit with this, and it is the following, because you stressed very much, and I welcome that very much too, the transnational aspect of the writing of a history of Europe, and you quoted Lord Acton. But I was thinking in another different aspect, which is the comparative aspect of the history of Europe, and now I'm not thinking on possible comparisons between different areas of Europe. I'm rather thinking of possible comparisons between Europe or European phenomena in the 19th century and the same phenomena or the same units of comparison out of Europe. The question has to do, because one of the problems that we have when we write the history of Europe is to try to tell the public something that at the end identifies Europe. So which are the main features that you in your narrative will choose to compare with other areas, non-European areas, to give the public an idea of what Europe is or was in the 19th century or was not in the 19th century? Also in the context of getting the attention of a Spanish and region or whatever you want on their current problems, or the way they can perceive the legacy of the 19th century European history in their lives today, because at the end this is what we are trying to do as historians. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, there is one country in the world where European history which does not consider its own history part of European history, and that is Britain. We conventionally, in schools and universities in Britain, European history has always been entirely separate from British history and has not included it. And this has a number of consequences. Personally, I think, although it's of course absolutely absurd, it has actually done a lot to foster and preserve British historians working on the continent of Europe. It's been very important that you have, conventionally in British universities, the professor of history has been British historian, the professor of modern history has always been what we call a Europeanist. So I'm going very much against the British tradition in thinking of Britain as part of Europe. Something which in today's Eurosceptic Britain is very controversial, so I try and make comparisons. Say, for example, if you're looking at conservative modernizers in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, then I think of together Bismarck, Cavour, Napoleon III, and Disraeli. So they all have lots of, because of very strikingly individual people, they have certain features in common. So that's the kind of way I'm doing with that. In terms of us, say Lucy being an Italian specialist and me being a German specialist and so on, that I think involves this kind of cultural exchange that we spend a lot of time in the countries we're writing about. And inevitably there's a kind of, you absorb a lot, I've absorbed a lot of the ways in which German historians write, think, the debates that they engage in. I engage in those, as well, I know a lot of them. So we are kind of cultural hybrids in that sense, because in Britain, European history is so different from British history. I've never taught British history, explicitly itself. So that makes, I think, that makes someone like me, I do not, in that sense, have a British perspective.
But if I may, I would try precisely to depersonalize the question. My question is to what extent you think that the fact that any historian, whatever it is, has a sort of background perspective from one particular academic or political context can affect the way we write the history of Europe. It's a very general question.
Well, of course it affects it enormously. I do, just at the very basic level, I do believe that British history is part of European history. But recently there's been a history of England by Simon Jenkins, who's the chairman of the National Trust, has a short history of England, where he says that English history has always been entirely separate from that of the European continent. And this is basically the way in which Mr. Gove's new curriculum is going to teach it as well, except when we've beaten the Continentals at, at Trafalgar or Waterloo or whatever it might be. So they set up this kind of antagonistic separateness, which is something I'm trying to get away with. And that's obviously a political statement in today's Britain. And there are many other ways. I think that history has to be very broad in its approach. But there are many people who think that political history is the only kind of history that is worth writing or studying. Again, if you look at the new national curriculum proposals, Mr. Gove, the Secretary of State for Education, thinks that's all that's really worth studying, apart from the Industrial Revolution. Everything else is political. Or one of the textbooks I mentioned is a purely political history. So there are methodological and theoretical individualities that I have that are not shared necessarily by others. Transnational and comparative, obviously both. I mean, in the end, you end up by comparing, let's say, it's fresh in my mind because I've been writing about it recently, the emancipation of the serfs. And these are, necessarily you compare how it happens in Hungary and what its results are in Hungary with how it happens in Romania. Because they're very, very different and they have different consequences. They're done in different ways. Or the simple fact that in Poland, in Congress Poland, because the Russian government wanted to weaken the nobility, the emancipation of the serfs happens on very favorable terms of the serfs. And this is not necessarily the case in the Habsburg Empire. So obviously comparison runs all the way through it. But at the same time, you're dealing with a number of common factors of serfdom and the ending of serfdom and the imperatives behind it and its consequences. So it's an attempt to combine both in a sense. And Europe and non-European comparison. Obviously, this book's already going to be 280,000 words. If I were to do that in any depth, it would be unacceptably long, and my editor would quite rightly get his red pencil out and start crossing bits out. I think, the fundamental, one of the things that is involved above all in the chapter on empire, where the obvious comparative point is economic. Europe is ahead of the rest of the world economically in this period. I think there are question marks when you look at the widespread assumption that this translated directly into political power and military power above all the rest of the world. If you start looking at empire, you can see plenty of instances in which European military power is not very successful, whether it's the Maori Wars in New Zealand or whether it's the Ashanti Wars in West Africa. There are other instances in which Europe's economic domination does not translate into military power, and that's got to do with the way that empire operates and the importance that European states accord to empire. So comparison with the rest of the world, yes, but I think only in a specific part of the book.
And you press the...
Yes, as a person who's struggling with the transnational history from the perspective of an area designated to be non-European, namely the Ottoman Empire, I have some methodological questions, or one really question. In order to sort of depict a shared history among European areas, you need to perhaps identify the concerns, the shared concerns. I didn't hear that. For instance, you mentioned empire. Is empire a shared concern, or is it a factor around which a concern is formed? One shared concern, and not Europe-wide, but worldwide, in the 19th century appears to be that of government. Governing inequality, for instance, and then power relations in that context would make more sense, I think. For instance, like one striking example of this, in the early part of the 19th century, when there were property revolts in France in the aftermath of the revolution, the Ottoman statesmen looking at the French situation were saying the French blew it. They couldn't manage. So from their perspective, it was a management issue. And well, Bentham would probably share that. So it is, there was in the 19th century, it appears to me, a conversation around the issues which was, which faced different areas. Which was definitely universal. And I didn't hear, for instance, you addressing the market issue, the generalization of market relations. The world turned upside down in the early part of the century. And that is a very universal issue, which is addressed by different regions, etc. I mean, you started with Lord Acton, and I wanted to hear the universals, and they didn't come through.
Yeah, I mean, market relations, obviously the spread of market relations through, I mean, they're there, of course. You know, the markets exist across Europe. There isn't a part of Europe where there isn't some kind of market, even very limited. But you have these processes like urbanization, industrialization, as Hobsbawm would have said, you know, the spread of domination, the growing domination of capital. So these are all economic processes. Yeah, sure, they happen at different speeds and different ways in different parts of Europe, but you can say that they are general features. The idea of government, I think it's slightly harder to deal with this notion of government and its power, or revolution and government power, the kind of opposition revolution government power. But there are clearly views the other way, that the Ottoman government itself is actually incapable of maintaining order over keeping a grip on its various domains. It is an imperialist power. The Ottomans treat Anatolia even as a kind of empire, let alone Northern Africa, Egypt, the Middle East, and all the rest of it. And you can see the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire as part of this process. An early example of this sort of undermining of the notion of empire might be one way to see that. Empire is a shared concern. Of course, I did say that Europeans tend to think of empire as a European phenomenon. That's the way I'm going to look at it. So I think that's another common feature, which I, as I mentioned, is part of my approach. So there are a number of common features that you mentioned that I'm already dealing with.
Okay, well, we have time for just a couple more questions. I know that Mark wants to ask a question. Would anyone else like to ask when we'll group them together? Natasha. Okay, so Mark and then Natasha. Is that all right? We just to bring it to a close.
Mentioned in the very beginning, you said that this is a history without footnotes. That the concept of the series, actually, of the Penguin histories, is not to have any footnotes. Now, one question, I suppose, would be, how do you personally cope with that? Do you feel deprived of your tools, or is there a way by which you still compensate by that in order to enable a dialogue with the reader? The second question is more about this as a kind of a trend recently of publishers bringing out books or whole series. I can think of the Cambridge Concise Histories, which uses no footnotes either. Now, is this merely a technical feature, or would you, as somebody who has reflected on the nature of history writing, how do you see this development?
Yeah, well, I tell you, doing without footnotes is a fantastic liberation. It's just wonderful. You know, I can write twice as fast as I've ever written before. It's amazing. Of course, it's kind of chance, because the original concept was to have these short books without footnotes, and there's nothing wrong with a short, concise, brief history, whatever you call it, that's not footnoted, that's designed for general readership. Unfortunately, and Penguin, the editor, Simon Winder at Penguin, rather regrets this, but unfortunately, one author delivered to length and on time. The very diligent American medievalist, William Chester Jordan, who delivered a short book on the Central Middle Ages in the mid-1990s, while the rest of us were all moving on to other things for a decade or so. And so since his book's not got any footnotes, and you can't go back and ask him to put them in, all of ours, which are much, 4 times the length of his, are without footnotes as well. And that is a bit of a problem, particularly because now there's a lot more detail in ours than there is in his. So I'm putting a lot of my sources, and not all of them, into a kind of Dropbox zone, and they'll be available on the internet eventually, not as footnotes, but simply we'll have a bit of work to do in sort of writing a little essay at the beginning of that, so how to find things and where they belong and so on. But that's about the most I can do. I mean, there are other authors who put, I know, sort of a whole footnoted text on the internet, but that's problematical because of copyright issues.
I'm aware that when you give a talk on a survey book like this, or a survey research project, there's the danger that everyone's questions are you going to mention this, and are you going to mention that? And so at the risk of adding yet another one to that pile, I'm aware it's not really very intellectually interesting just to go through all the things that, yes, are in the book, but you couldn't mention in the talk. But I wondered if you're going to go into it all, a number of concerns that historians of the 20th century are now reading back into the 19th century, in particular the development of international law and humanitarianism and a bunch of these problems. People are now talking about the history of minorities protection or humanitarian intervention, reaching back into questions of protecting Jewish and Christian minorities in the Ottoman Empire, for example, is really growing out of a 19th century set of concerns, but also for the early development of international organizations, if you will. So not only international law to codification, but also perhaps the Concert of Europe as a proto-League of Nations, where the great powers are wrestling with the problem of international order in an early sense. But leaving that aside, what may be more intellectually useful is to think about your 2 organizing themes. So you said what gives your period, your chosen period, coherence are 2 things. One, this being the age of European hegemony, and the other that this is an age of a general pursuit of power. So I wondered about this idea of an age of European hegemony. Is there any danger if you begin with that? If that is your the point from which you proceed your inquiry, is there any danger of downplaying the fragility of that power, or its patchiness, if you will? And some of the things you raised in response to Bartolome's question about the unevenness of that power, is there a danger in losing some of that complexity if you begin from that previous position? And secondly, on the idea of this being an age of the pursuit of power, it strikes me that the 19th century is an age in which conceptions of legitimate power are under radical transformation, hugely in flux. Concepts of political and social power are really coming apart from that older Europe. So to what extent do you try and, if you will, chart the changing normative contours of the concept of power itself? Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Right, well, they're very interesting questions. I think, yeah, obviously one of the interesting things about, let's say, the Ottoman irregulars, massacres of Bulgarians in the 1880s is, of course, they become a major political issue in Britain because Gladstone uses them to come back into politics. Similarly with the Armenian horrors, or whatever they called them in British politics. So there's a kind of a lot of broader concerns about these things. But I mean, the overall, again, it's a question of balance. Of course, you have a massive number of international organizations, as I mentioned, and international regulations, international conferences, and so on. On the other hand, this is a period in which you have the beginnings of genocide you have genocidal conflicts between different ethnic groups, particularly under the Ottomans, and then of course breaking out in the Balkan Wars, First and Second Balkan Wars, just before the First World War. Some of the conflicts there have a distinctly genocidal edge, which look forward to the short-lived Balkan Wars of the 1990s. So minorities are certainly a very important aspect of that of the book in that sense. The fragility of European power, as I already mentioned, I think when you start looking at how empire actually worked, you can see absolutely how extraordinarily fragile it is and how comparatively easy it was for it to be all toppled over in the following period. Nevertheless, in the 19th century, the Europeans didn't have any consciousness of how fragile their power was. And you look at where they described the British reactions to their failure to defeat the Maoris, a simple puzzlement. How can we possibly lose? It's impossible. It's ridiculous. There's no comprehension there of any kind of possible military equality. The legitimation of power and the way in which power changes, concepts of power. I think that's something I've got to think about. I mean, I was just given it a title, The Pursuit of Power, but I can't make that as a concept permeate the whole book, because that will reduce it to the level of a kind of a tract in a way. But that's certainly a very interesting point I'll try and bear in mind.
Okay, well, so you were extremely kind of upfront when you started your talk in explaining the genesis of this book and how you've come to write it. So I since I've been chairing it, I'm going to ask the last question, which is, do you think you would have written this had you not had this being sort of in this contract? I mean, did you come back to the 19th century because of this contract, or was there a sense in which you wanted to come back to the 19th century anyway after you'd finished your books on Nazi Germany?
Well, I mean, it's a very embarrassing question. I think,
That's why I asked it.
of course, I'm used to it from Ulysses. So I think the answer is that it somehow all kind of fell into place. I mean, I wasn't thinking about doing it, and I did have other contracts which I cancelled at some cost to myself. One was the Oxford Illustrated History of Germany, which when I finally said I was going to write it, the editor turned around and said, well, can you do it so that it can be published without pictures? And I thought this is a bit of a kind of undermine the whole purpose of a book where I was going to integrate the pictures and the text, where he just wanted a text with a few illustrations. So there are other contracts that I didn't honour, but this always seemed to me, since I'd spent so many years actually teaching 19th century European history, I had a whole massive of lecture notes, which of course won't find their way into the book in the form in which I wrote them, but the fact that I've been teaching this is very important. I did not want to write this book really for all the period I was interested in Nazi Germany, but having finished with Nazi Germany in 2008, then I sort of wanted something different. I was just a bit fed up with writing about all of this. I thought I'd written pretty well everything I wanted to write about the Nazis for the time being. And it's better to get back to a period which in some ways is more civilized, and which I felt, and so my friend Ian Kershaw would certainly agree with this, that I knew a lot about. So there are those motives. And I think had I not realized that in the intervening period when global history entered the scene, had that not happened, I'd have had more serious doubts about coming back to this. But it seemed to me an opportunity to say something, to kind of package European history in a new and different way. So I'm actually very glad to have got back to this period and to be writing about that, about these things. And even though, of course, it's turned out to be much more difficult and time-consuming than I thought, because it's, as several of you said, it's a ridiculously ambitious project, and it's covering so many different things and so on. Yeah, I think the answer is I'm quite pleased to have got back to it, and this time sort of seems right.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for this, Richard. I hope that we've given you, perhaps as many ideas as you've given us. You've certainly given me a whole series of ideas. So thank you very much for coming, and I hope you all join me in thanking Richard.
Perhaps it's worth announcing everyone that
Yes.
this conversation about the way in which we sort of conceptualize, organize, periodize the writing of the history of Europe will continue pretty soon, because we are organizing a roundtable about Eric Hobsbawm's work and historiography and legacy, which is coming up on March 13th. So it will be, in many ways, a continuation of the themes of this discussion, even though, of course, we will be without Professor Evans. Thank you so much.
Thank you.